this class is really going to have like two portions to it. It's going to have, the first portion of it is going to be, we're going to talk about the function of storytelling in, I'm sorry, are you recording now?
Yes.
Okay, good. We're going to talk about the function and purpose of storytelling both in a game, in game terms, and within the context of the culture of Britannis, and then I'm going to give you guys some tips on creating and crafting stories to tell in game. So, going from like the top down, everything we do in game is effectively storytelling in one way, shape, or form, both on the staff side and on the player side. Every plot we put out, every NPC we put on the field is telling a story in the grand sense of things. If you think of multiple arcs of storytelling, okay, and we're talking about your classic exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, ending format, okay? Also, I'm going to be assuming a bunch of terms here. If you don't understand one of those terms, please don't hesitate to ask. But I'm kind of going from I'm going to assume you know some basic storytelling concepts. If you don't, we can absolutely go back and break those down and talk about them in depth and break it down. So please don't feel like, if you're feeling lost, or if I'm using words that you don't understand, please don't hesitate to ask, because really every piece that we discuss is just going to add to the experience. Also, I don't want this to just be like me vomiting information at you guys, so I want this to be more of a kind of a discussion until we get to the workshop portion. So if you have comments and things to say, please speak up. There's only like, 8 or 9 of us in the room here, so it's not like this is a big lecture hall or anything, even though the room is giant. So does everybody understand the words that I've used up to this point? The exposition. Okay, so let's go through those pieces just to be sure. So exposition is, Star Wars is a perfect example, okay? It's episode 4, because episodes 1 through 3 don't exist. So we'll go with episode 4, all right? So you begin in the middle of the story, okay, with the Star Destroyer coming out. And that's called an in medias res, or in the middle of the action beginning. But if we ignore that first scene, everything that happens after that follows a really standard storytelling structure. You start out with a block of time where you are setting the stage, okay? You're introducing who your characters are, you're introducing what their motivations and goals are, and you're introducing the conflicts that exist within that world, okay? In terms of Britannis, in terms of the overarching larger Britannis story, that would have been basically our first 3 years of game. The next step in the story arc is the rising action, where the situation that is established changes and the drama gets turned up a notch, okay? There is one of the conflicts that is introduced explodes and becomes the rising action of the story, meaning it becomes the primary line that we are following, okay? And then you get to your climax, which is when whatever your big change is going to be, where your hero/heroes confront your conflict and some kind of major change happens. Depending on what kind of a story you're telling, it could be a change for the better, it could be a change for the worse, it could be, if it's tragedy, everybody dies. That's not the story we're telling yet. And then you get into what's called the denouement, which is the resolution phase. And it's because of what happened at the climax, these other things have happened because of it, and then you end your story, okay? Note that there's no value judgments on anything in that arc. So your arc climax, your rising action, your climax can be really awful things that are happening, and your denouement might be everyone's life is horrible after that, but it still follows the same major beats of story. So if you take that arc, you can apply that arc on all kinds of different scales in any kind of story. You can have a little itty bitty exposition, rising action, climax, denouement in like a chapter of a book, okay? You can have it in a paragraph or two even. If somebody encounters somebody on the road, You've got your establishing action that they meet somebody on the road and here's the situation. Your rising action is they turn out to be a bandit. Your climax is the fight that happens with the bandits, and your denouement is all the bad guys die and the heroes move on. Okay? That can be a teeny little like 3-paragraph story in and of itself in the midst of another larger story. And then if you want to get really complex with it, you can actually map out the individual character arcs of individual characters within that story that may land at different points. So the climax for character A might actually be the rising action for character B. So character A's resolution happens here, character B's resolution happens here, and the overarching story is still going on over here. That's very similar to what we're doing in Britannis. We have dozens of miniature arcs within a much larger arc for the season, within a much larger arc for the chapter. We're telling small stories that are inside of a bigger story, that are inside of a bigger story, that are inside of a bigger story. House Costain being a perfect example. House Costain's story started with the establishing action in our first couple of events with basically this house is in a really bad situation. That was their establishment. And then when Gorlawis and Igraine took the knee to Uther, that was the beginning of their rising action. Because that was the push towards change for them. Their climax for this chapter could be considered so far the death of Gorlawis and Igraine's turn from being House Costain to House Ambrosius and now Queen. And we're possibly, assuming things don't change, hitting the beginning of the denouement phase for House Costain before we see what the resolution is going into chapter 2. Andy.
You bring up a good point about the climax. Sometimes you think you're in the climax, but you're not yet. Mm-hmm. And depending on the story and how the story is being told. And sometimes there's twists within the denouement, but it's not the big twist, you know? And so,
like, I guarantee House Costain didn't think that they were in what could have been a climax when Gorlawis came running in.
Right.
You know, and by the time everybody is red-faced and sobbing at the end of it, I think everybody had a pretty good idea that that was a major event for House Costain.
Wouldn't you agree, Zach?
Yes.
So similarly for House Ambrosius, their steam got rolling way slower. They picked up way slower, and now they're starting to hit their rising action and potentially a climax with a new queen and a new push for action that will potentially lead on into chapter 2. So House Ambrosius might not have even hit their climax yet. They might not have a climax this chapter. A lot of that is up to the players at this point, but in a very real way, there are arcs within arcs within arcs within arcs. A very small scale example of that would actually be Sabia. And I'm going to be using an example in the next class too. Sabia has had a short, sharp spike over 2 seasons. She came on screen, made a very bold choice, and got dumped into a story that none of us really anticipated. And in terms of storytelling in Britannis as a player in particular, Emily's case is is a really great example to point out, because in terms of stories and in terms of plot, those terms are kind of interchangeable in terms of a LARP. And what Emily did was show up on screen and make a really bold choice, and then gathered other players into that story and got them invested in that story, and it became bigger. What I mean by that is the story of Sabia's demon taint could have been very small and resolved very quickly, but Emily grabbed other characters and got them interested in that story. So as staff, we began to change the story that was written originally because of the investment that Emily was getting other players involved in. She turned a personal story into a group story, and therefore staff was able to and aided by the investment that other players had in that story. So we were able to make that story bigger and grander, and ended up with a 2-hour battle against demons for the climax of our season 3. But all of the elements of the story is there, and Sabia is definitely very much in the denouement phase of her story now, or of a story that she has been telling, because there's a couple other little stories that she's also telling. But the rising action is, or the exposition is when she got the demon taint. The rising action is her trying to figure out how to get rid of it and all of the people gathering in and gathering information on how do we do this and it becoming a community effort is the rising action of that. And then the climax is obviously the giant battle wherein she fought the demon and barely survived and all that. So of that story, it's short, within 5 events maybe, all said and done? 5 weekend events?
Yeah, something like that.
And the interludes and stuff that happen in between of that, but it's still a very clear arc, okay? So in terms of storytelling in a LARP, that's really what we're looking at, is those individual bumps. And inside of the bump, or the arc for the game season, because we try to have starting, rising, and ending action for the season, and then the overarching arc for the entire chapter. So, okay, so do I need to go over the different portions of a story and how we apply them anymore? Does anybody have anything to say about that? Okay. So, in terms of how we tell a story as our characters in-game, we take that same structure and we take that same focus and we apply it to whatever topic we are trying to tell a story about. I'm going to pick on Spencer a little bit. Most of his classes that he teaches as Ghazi in-game aren't really stories in the sense that we're talking about right now, and that's fine. His Ghazi teaching rambles are fantastic and wonderful, and I love them, and I don't want him to stop. But in terms of telling a structured story, a lot of what he does doesn't have the structure that engages people. And part of the reason this structure exists is because the human mind is wired to accept information, process information, change information, and then categorize information. And the different sections of the story apply to different areas of the brain neurologically. You can actually look up, there's some really cool studies on Australian Aboriginal storytelling, and people watching a video of an Aboriginal shaman or whatever religious leader in their community while they're getting an MRI. And you can actually see different areas of their brain light up as the storyteller starts different areas of the story as it progresses. So neurologically speaking, we are tapping different areas of our brain as we are telling these different stories. So when you are choosing to tell a story as a character in game, you need to understand what you're doing. It will make everything you do in terms of telling those stories better, and it will also make sure that people retain and are more invested in the stories that you are telling. And take a drink and wait for the train to go by. Okay. It's also worth noting that you are not required to stand up in front of a crowd and announce, "I am about to tell a story," or anything even remotely close to that. Some of the best experiences I have ever had at a game, and I think Brad and I and Andy are probably the most veteran LARPers that we've got in the room right now. Some of my most favorite moments over my entire LARPing career are the telling a story around the fire at the end of the day moments. And you don't have to announce I'm telling a story.
Actually, one of the coolest things about that is you might not even know you're telling a story until you've started and no one else is talking
and everybody's suddenly listening and staring
like,
at you. Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta do something.
Shit, what was that?
Yeah, and so
and that's
an organic story. It just it happens.
Right, but once you realize that you are actually in that moment and everybody's paying attention to you and you are telling a story, what I want to do is give you some on-the-fly tips that you can use in order to frame your stories in such a way that they're presented well. So this doesn't have to be something that is rehearsed ahead of time. I'm going to go over some steps to help you refine an official story, like I'm going to present this story at this thing. But keep in mind, you don't have to do all of the steps all of the time. I'm just giving you the complete toolbox, and you can use individual pieces of that as you see fit. should have started off with this, and I didn't. I'm sorry. I have the majority of a degree in theater, and the focus that I was working on when I was at Emporia State is called oral interpretation. So it is literally storytelling. If my life had gone a different path, I was actually looking at trying to be a professional storyteller. Somebody kind of like a motivational speaker, but somebody who goes and does programs for kids in schools and whatever, and tells stories of literature and whatnot to audiences in a live fashion. It's an art form that's dying and, in my opinion, needs to be preserved. And one of the reasons storytelling, face-to-face verbal storytelling in Britannis is so important and built into the world is because that's how we communicate in real life.
So before we go forward with this is a game mechanic, my question would be, in real storytelling, like a happenstance that happened, there's a lot of embellishment and there's a lot of, instead of killing, one big buck, I killed 17 big bucks,
The details change.
So as a game mechanic, is that embellishment of an in-game story okay?
Well,
That's a good question.
what you're actually talking about has technical terms attached to it. And one is telling a natural story, and one is telling a mythological story. Telling a natural story is the beat by beat, by the numbers, how it happened in the real world. As Americans in the age in which we live, typically stories are assumed to be natural. You don't have to pick one or the other, but if your story beats that you choose to share all follow the same theme, your audience will be more tuned in to the reality or disreality of what you are saying at the time. If I start out my story saying something along the lines of, it was October and it was raining and I was up in my tree stand and there was a deer who crossed in front of me. That is an entirely different story, but equally as valid as I sat in the tree stand and I was shivering and the wind was blowing in my face like a banshee and I couldn't see anything until the shadow moved from behind a tree and walked into the glade in front of me. Those are two equally valid storytelling techniques. And they are telling two entirely different stories, but using the same information. In terms of Britannis, or playing the game, it is completely up to you which version of storytelling you want to do. And if you want to do research on storytelling, there's other versions too. But in terms of telling a natural story or a mythological story, that's a character choice, and neither one is invalid. I would say that Bryn and Norn would be far more likely to tell a mythological version, and Britons and Kemri and probably both of our elves would be more likely to tell a natural story.
What about dwarves?
Dwarves probably would be
Natural?
either one, really.
Okay.
Kemri have the history of being distrusted, so them telling, you know what, they might actually tell mythological stories to each other, but tell natural stories to non-Kemri, specifically because of the cultural distrust action. I love that we're kind of writing cultural canon right now. That's really neat. Because if you extrapolate that out a little bit, it could be considered a mark of respect among the Kemri to be included as an audience for a mythological storytelling. I hope you don't feel like I dodged your question.
Well, the only reason I brought it up is because it's fun to tell stories, and it's fun to get people excited about the story you're telling.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the potential, and I have seen happen for the misinformation to go about because of, well, he said.
Where you're telling a mythological story and somebody
Yeah,
thinks
and
that
like,
you're telling.
hey, he said he picked up a whole wall and moved it over here, and I thought, what's the spell he? Now it's canon as opposed to no, that was an explanation of some supernatural thing that may or may not have happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sure.
And so what I was
when you're
asking.
dealing with a world that has real magic in it, you kind of need to be more obvious about which version of the story
Okay.
you're telling.
Okay.
So if you're going to exaggerate, so I'm going to address your question. I'm going to go back a little bit. We're going to talk about some techniques, and
Okay,
then
sure.
there's cues that you can use to let your audience know what kind of story you're telling.
Gotcha.
But first, let's go back and let's put ourselves in the context of I'm going to be telling a mythological story, and I'm going to be mythologizing. I just made up a word there. A thing that has actually happened to my character. Okay. The first thing you need to decide is what you're going to be telling the story about. And like Brad said, you might realize that you're in the middle of telling a story and suddenly everyone's looking at you, so guess what? Your topic was already picked for you. Or you might be like Ghazi, who was given a story to tell, knew what his subject matter was going to be in a kind of general sense, but had to pick his own beats of story that he was going to tell. One thing people get, I'm not going to say wrong, but muddy. One thing people get muddy when they're storytelling is the arc of their own story. They start here and then they go off to Albuquerque, to use a Bugs Bunny reference, right? They turn left at Albuquerque. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in terms of telling a story for a purpose, that's not what you're doing. You need to start with your story beats, and I typically pick 5 because they usually map to my exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, and then I get one other bullet to throw in there, whichever one I want, one extra that I can fill in whatever that is. And those bullets roughly map to the story beats that we mentioned earlier. You've got your exposition, so you've got a beat where you tell the story, you tell the section of the story that explains the stage. You set the stage for your audience. Okay. If we're using the Night of Long Knives story, it's setting the stage for, we're way back in the past, before the Tiberian invasion. We're telling the story of the races of giants. We're telling the story of the conflict between the Bryn migrants and the giants who were living there. We're getting a little bit of the character of the Fomorians before they were cursed. All of those things are the exposition chunk of that story. We're setting the stage, and we are literally letting the other people who are listening, our audience, know these are the players that we're going to be messing with through this story.
For a story like that, would you find that you might spend a lot more time on the exposition because there's so much, because that history matters for the ultimate betrayal that will happen?
There's 2 things to think about in that, actually, and one is the context of your audience. If I was telling that story to a non-Britannis audience, it would have an entirely different exposition section. Okay. It would be removed of a lot of the proper names and nouns, and it would be a much more generic version of that story. Likewise, if, say, I was telling that story to non-Brit, in-game, telling that story to an entirely non-Brit audience, there's cultural stuff in there that those other characters would need to be informed of that if I'm talking to a Brit audience are just assumed. And that really goes for storytelling in any context, is if you look out in your audience and you see a bunch of teenagers, you're going to tell your story slightly differently than you would if it's a bunch of old people. Not necessarily because of their intelligence level or activity or anything like that, but because they're going to have a different context of the world than the other audience would. And you don't have to do a survey of your audience ahead of time to know, but it's good to have a concept of who you're speaking to when you're telling a story of any kind. And this goes for if you're at work telling a story to a boardroom versus at school telling a story to a class, that kind of thing. This class goes.
Oh, you were talking about beats.
Right. So you've got your 5 beats of a story, right? So you've got your exposition where you set the stage, and in your exposition you need to name the players. Okay. You need to let the audience know who you're going to be talking about for the rest of the story. So in Star Wars, we start out with Princess Leia, we start out with Darth Vader, and then we immediately go to Luke, C-3PO, R2-D2, and Obi-Wan. And then just a little bit later after that, we drop in Han and Chewie. And that's the cast for the rest of the story. So the exposition really ends when they leave Mos Eisley and the whole cast is together. Or at least the whole cast has been introduced. Okay, so the exposition section of Star Wars ends as they fly away from Mos Eisley. Your next beat is rising action, and that is where the heat on your conflict gets turned up. In Star Wars, we know we need to get to Alderaan, and as they're flying away, the Empire is chasing them, right? And Princess Leia is on the Death Star, and we find out what the bad guys' plans are. In the Night of Long Knives story, the rising action is the choice of the protagonist of that story to decide to break with the traditions. Well, no, actually, I guess the rising action would actually be the first Night of Long Knives, where all of the Bryn
Calling them all
leadership
together.
is killed.
Oh, okay. Killing. Okay.
Yeah, because if you take the story as actually the protagonist's story and not the Bryn's story in that, because you could tell a version of it that's a version of that story that's from the Bryn leadership's angle. But if you're taking that one individual character as the protagonist, then the rising action of his story would actually be the Night of Long Knives when all of his family gets murdered. And then the climax of that story would be him making the choice to turn the curse back on the Fomorians. And then the denouement is the explanation of what actually happened to him afterwards and the repercussions of turning that curse back. And then you get an extra beat to throw in wherever you want on whatever you would want to actually talk about. In that one, in that story, it probably benefits you to put the extra beat in the exposition section. If you're talking to an audience who has already heard that story, you can place that beat somewhere else if you want to put the emphasis somewhere else. If that story is being told to, at the Arcanum, for example, you might focus on the climax and the actual details of what that ritual were and how it worked and turning the magic back on its own thing, because that's what your audience is going to want to know about and hear about, and the thing that's going to be most exciting to them.
If you're talking to politicians or policymakers, you might focus on the denouement, actually, and the results. This is what we have to deal with because this happened.
And if you're talking to a bunch of fighters, you might want to talk about the battles in the war that led up to that choice being made in the first place. So that extra beat is really how you can custom craft your story for your audience. So you pick what your 5 beats are in your particular story, okay? And then you, as part of that or as its own separate step, you can choose who your characters are, because different versions of telling the exact same story can include different characters, okay? You can genericize a character out, like I've been doing, talking about the protagonist of that story. You can make it specific and proper name them. Every time you drop a proper name, it adds emphasis to that. One of the things ancient storytellers did in the real world is when they were telling their epic poems, which would go on for hours or potentially days, depending on how memorized and long the particular poem was, they would go into the lineage of a particular character for a long time, because they're dropping all these proper names. And every time you see a lineage like that, and they do it in the Bible too, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, like cut 15 minutes later, begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, right? That's because those stories weren't originally written down. Those stories were originally told face-to-face in oral tradition, and 2,000 and whatever years ago, those names meant something to somebody. The people sitting there listening to that story are hearing the lineage of who's gonna be our protagonist. And the weight of the importance of that character is being established by naming off their ancestry. And also, you can assume that at some point, all of those characters had a story that could be told about them too. So as you're the audience, the person telling the story has this list of 17 names, and the audience doesn't know what story they're telling yet. So if it's, and so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, and his story is, the audience is going, who are you going to talk about? Who are you going to talk about? Who are you going to talk about? Oh, cool, I love this story! And then you continue to go on and you get a little bit more, who are they? As you continue down that lineage. It's a very historical thing to do, and the storyteller would be using vocal techniques to increase the tension as he continues through that so-and-so begat so-and-so, like, who am I going to talk about? Who am I going to talk about? Because this is This is their primetime
HBO.
TV. Yeah, it's their HBO. It's their Game of Thrones. Literally, actually, it's their Game of Thrones, and their entertainment. And that's one of the reasons that we tried to bake in storytelling into our game environment so much, because that is how your characters would be entertaining each other when the snow is 3 feet deep outside their door, and you can trudge over to the hut next door, and everybody's huddling together telling stories, because that's the world that these characters live in. Sorry, I went way off in the weeds on that one. I apologize. So you've got your 5 story beats. You've got your 4+1, right? You've got your characters. Typically, in an oral tale, it's not good to have more than 3 characters on screen at the same time. If you think about Beowulf, okay? If you read the story Beowulf, and I highly recommend the recent translation from the dude whose name I can't remember, Sean something, I think. It's amazing, and it's, in my opinion, the best translation that's been done so far. Emily probably has her own opinions on that. There's no more than 3 characters on screen at the same time. It's Beowulf is talking to the king and the king's son, or he's talking to this one of his comrades and this one of his comrades. And anytime there's 3 characters on screen, you're not going to see somebody coming in without somebody leaving. And if somebody leaves, you don't have to say, and then they left. But what you do is you shift the screen back to these 3 characters, and this character basically doesn't exist in that tale anymore. So
Shakespeare did very much the same thing.
Yep.
The Lord Capulet would walk off, but he'd come back on later when he had more lines, but it gives that focus on those characters.
Yep,
So.
that's exactly right. So if you're having dialogue between characters, or if you're having 2 characters in a scene who are talking to one another, you can add a third, but if you do want to add somebody else, you need to step away and introduce somebody else. So if, say, King Uther, Queen Igraine, and Random Hero X are having a conversation, if Random Hero X is our protagonist and he's talking to the king and the queen, and Lady Blackwood walks in, that's too many on screen at once. So one of those characters needs to stop talking, and it can't be the one who just arrived. So if you have somebody who just walks in for one line in your actual real world story, you don't need to name them, and in fact shouldn't. So if I'm telling a story and we are gathered in town and the battle is coming and Baldwin runs in and says, it's time, the bad guys are coming, I don't name Baldwin when I'm telling that story. I say, and then one of our fellow heroes ran in, told us the battle was about to begin, and Sabia and Quinn and I ran to the battlefield. It's okay to write people out of the story. I'm gonna say that again. It's okay to write people out of the story.
That conflicts with our natural...
It does. It conflicts with our American, I have to give credit to everyone but myself, brain. But in terms of telling a story, you distill down what the important beats and notes are. You distill down here's what I'm actually saying, here's who actually took part, and this is the story that those beats are telling. You don't have to include the historical accuracy of, and then this person came in and said this thing and did this one thing and then left. It can be, and then my fellow heroes did this thing, because you're keeping the action focused where you want to point the camera. If you think of yourself as doing a Star Wars-like tale, so we talked about beats, we talked about characters. Okay, let's talk about some nitty-gritty. So I'm going to go into a section here that I'm talking about like Ghazi doing an actual presentation of a story. Once you get your beats, once you get your characters, once you figure out the actual story that you want to be telling, you need to write down the details of it. And I would suggest for beginning storytellers, you don't have more than 5 bullet points per beat. Okay? You're looking at telling probably a 20, 25-minute story here. If you are using a couple of sentences per beat, and then you've got your 5 overarching beats. When you break all those out and then you spread them out, you're looking at a story that's about 20 to 25 minutes at its absolute maximum. Unless you have notes in front of you, or you are actually trained, which I am not, in memorization of epic storytelling kind of things, you're going to lose pieces. And you'll be frustrated at the end of telling your own story instead of feeling triumphant. So you keep your bullet points individualized, and you keep your bullet points up underneath their topics. So if I have my bullet point that is setting the stage, my 5 bullet points are going to be setting the who, what, when, where, why of my story. Okay? My rising action is also going to be doing the who, what, when, where, why, but I can eliminate those bullets as needed if I've already covered them. And I can use those bullets to cover the rising action of the story. So if we're going back to Sabia's story, the rising action might be her naming the heroes who aided her in finding the information. And this hero found this piece of information, and this hero found this piece of information, and I researched and found that these things were true, and all of that is the rising action. Okay? And then you get to the climax, and she can tell that story in a multitude of ways. She could tell that story from the viewpoint of the people defending the ritual, the ones who went up on the hill and were attacking the Fomorians. She could tell that story from her own point of view of, this is what I remember happening. I could feel that I was possessed and the demons were using me as a doorway, and then the prime demon was in front of me, and that happened. She could tell the story from the context of the ritualists who were casting the ritual. But she probably shouldn't try and tell the whole story of all 3 groups. Depending on her audience and depending on what she's trying to say, if she picks one and mentions the other 2, then that is keeping to the core of whatever story she is actually telling. She's acknowledging that those other things happened, and she's not straying away from the story to where the audience is going, oh, I'm going this way. Oh, then the one up the hill. Oh, okay, and then they're guarding the ritual. What? Okay, what are you actually trying to say here? Whichever one of those 3 she chooses maintains the through line of the story that she's actually telling, and the other 2 are embellishing, adding details to the story that's going on. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I just had an aha moment because I'm a terrible storyteller, but
I would disagree, but okay.
well, I can write a story. I can't tell a story. The idea, getting from that natural to mythological, those different types, the idea that it's not a testimony, it's a story.
Yep.
And so I get wrapped up in, because usually I'm trying to share information that happened. That's not always what you're doing. There's a place for testimony, but that's not storytelling.
Right.
So
Yep.
if that
Now,
helps people. But,
testimony can be storytelling.
oh, sure.
But it's usually not as useful as a naturally told story in the I'm trying to impart information to you versus the I'm trying to entertain you.
Right.
Those are 2 cross purposes, and unless you're trying to give mythological information, like say telling a mythological story about rain, R-H-A-I-N-E for those of you watching at home, you're not going to benefit your audience by blending those 2. Yeah, I'm not going to drop any chapter 2 spoilers right now. Okay. So you do your 5 bullet points per story beat, and then you have to find a place to have your climax, and you have to find a place for your end. Okay? Sabia's story ending depends on where Emily decides she's going to say, this is the end of this story. It's important to remember that there's a difference between the end of this story and the end of the protagonist's story. Okay? Like, the end of the story of Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope is entirely different from the end of the story of Luke Skywalker. If I'm telling a verbal version of A New Hope, I'm not gonna follow Luke all the way to Episode 7 with a girl trying to hand him a lightsaber and he being like, "Whoa, I only got one hand, yo." I'm going to tell the story of A New Hope, or I might tell the story of Mos Eisley, even. Like the arc through Mos Eisley for Luke is a story that could be told on its own as its own individual beginning, middle, and end, because he chases the droids into the desert. He makes the choice to become a Jedi. He comes home and his aunt and uncle are dead. He goes with the old man to Mos Eisley. They make the decision to actually leave in the cantina. They get on the ship, they're chased off, and then they leave. That is a complete story arc right there. Okay, so I can tell that beat, that whole thing, beginning, middle, and end. I don't have to tell Luke all the way down to the end because that doesn't benefit my audience. Okay? This is where storytellers in a historical context, this is why they were able to walk up to a castle and say, I'm going to tell stories for a week and you're going to pay me, food, water, lodging, and cash so that I can move on. Why? Because I know all this shit. Because I can stand in front of your hall and tell a story every night that's going to make people pound on the table and tell me to come back the next night. And I can do that for weeks. Because I can take 15 minutes of a movie or 20 minutes of a movie and I can turn it into a story that'll last for an hour. And then you'll ask me to come back the next night and I'll tell the story of him getting off of the Death Star. And then I'll tell the story of him doing the trench run. And all of those are sequential individual arcs of story that, as a storyteller, I can choose to tell the entire arc of episode 4, or I can tell the arc of Mos Eisley. And then I can tell the arc of getting off of the Death Star and all of those individual pieces. And all of those are completely valid stories, and it's up to you as the storyteller to figure out what beats you're telling. So I've got my beats, I've got my characters, I know what my sub-bullet points are. If we are doing a presentational story, I'm about to get up and move because I'm feeling jittery. If we are telling a presentational story like Ghazi and his amazing prop, our next step is to write all of those bullets out. You're slowly but surely expanding and you're weeding out the words that are wrong to tell the story, okay? So I take those bullets and I expand those bullets into a couple of sentences each, and then I've got the bones of a good story there. At that point, I'm going to do a couple of different things. And this is getting into the craft of verbal storytelling, which could be its own separate class, but I'm going to kind of hit these pretty quick because we're coming up on our class period. I was hoping to have a little bit more interaction and have you guys actually crafting, but I ended up monologuing. I'm sorry. So one of the things you want to do is you want to say it out loud into a mirror, because you're going to practice your gesticulations. You're going to practice the physical transformations that you do when you're talking about different characters, and all of those things add into your storytelling, and there's multitudes of research that you can do on your own into how to physically enact when you're teaching stories, or when you're telling stories. It's important to remember that you're not play acting fully, okay? All you're trying to do is give the audience the indication of the character and letting their brain fill in the rest, because if you're telling your story correctly, they're not looking at you. They're actually looking at the painting that you are portraying with your words in front of them. They're seeing all of the scene that their imagination is filling in, and your words are actually just providing sensory information for their brains to process. This goes back to that MRI thing that I was telling you. When you get into the meat of your story through the center 3 beats of your story, the parts of the brain that include art and painting and sculpture are activated, and they are literally creating in their mind the painting and sculpture of the story that you are telling if you're doing it right, if they're engaged. So practice into a mirror. Practice into a mirror until all you have to do is look down at your bullet point and you know the sentences that you're about to speak. Don't worry about memorization, okay? You're not an ovate of the Druid Order. You're not required to know every single word with every single inflection. What you're trying to do is get the points across. You're trying to get the lyrical flow of your story across. But get to the point where you can be rehearsing and look down and see what your next bullet point is and know what you're moving into. You can also keep those bullet points on you so that if that fireside comes up and the lull in the action comes, you can be like, and there I was. And if everybody has one of those in their pocket, the whole game culture in-game changes and transforms, because there's always stories being told. Brett's really good at that, in fact. I would in fact go so far as to say that's one of the reasons when we started Britannica, I was like, hey Brad, you wanna come play? Oh, you got a wife too? Yeah, right, you got a wife, bring her along, come on.
Something might happen, she can be
Then,
cool.
you know, maybe. So rehearse into a mirror, okay? And then grab a friend, or videotape yourself. These 2 steps need to happen, but they don't have to happen in any particular order. Once you feel like you've rehearsed it a few times and you can glance down and know what your bullet points are, either videotape yourself and then watch yourself, no matter how painful you feel like it is. I hate it. I hate it. When I was doing the story for this last year's Winter Feast, I recorded myself, and I hate it, but it's useful.
And everyone hates the sound of their own voice.
It's true.
That's not how you
It's true.
sound to yourself.
Like, I will probably end up watching this video and cringing through the whole thing, But the fact is, it's useful. Knowing where you are putting emphasis where you don't want to put emphasis, or knowing where you need to put more emphasis instead of in a particular location, is important in terms of you crafting that story. And again, we're not talking about perfection here, we're talking about fun. So if it stops being fun, stop. Put it away, come back to it in a couple days, whatever. This is an amount of work, I'm not lying. But the end result for both you and for the game as a whole can be tremendous. So once you have either done the video or, well, the other step of the video is tell the story to a friend. And I'm gonna tell you, some people are going to instruct you or suggest that you tell the person what you're trying to communicate beforehand, and I disagree with that. I suggest when you're telling your story to your friend individually, you do it cold. And at the end, you ask them, what do you think I was trying to get across with that story? Or what do you think my story beats were? Can you give me a one-sentence version of the beginning, middle, and end of the story? Don't prime them or prep them for what you're intending to get across, because communication is based on the recipient. Communication isn't actually based on the sender of the information. Communication is actually entirely dependent on what the receiver gets. So it's up to you guys to rehearse and get the story to the person get the story you're intending to tell to the audience. And if you're not, then maybe you need to go back and look at what your bullets and your characters are and figure out where you need to zhuzh some stuff, as my wife would say, to make those bullet points and story beats match what you're actually trying to say, and then you go back and do the process again. And it doesn't have to be super long and drawn out or involved and in depth, and you can scribble it down on a napkin if you want to. But those tips and techniques, when used in sequence, will give you a thing in your pocket that you can pull out at any point in time, and it will get people telling you, "Hey, you gonna tell a story at this event? Hey, are you gonna tell a story at this event?" Very quickly. Word travels amazingly fast for people who bring entertainment and fun to the game on their own. They make the game more real, they make the game more intense, and they make the game more interactive and immersive. And frankly, they make the game more fun for everybody. And it gives you something to do in those moments where you're waiting for something, or there's a lull in the action, or any one of a number of situations. So what I'm going to ask, I'm going to put you guys on the spot. What is a story? I'm going to go through everybody, so get your brains ready. What is a story that you think you could tell in game at Britannis? It doesn't have to be something about you. It doesn't have to be something about something that you were present for, but just a thing in which you think you would be interested in telling the story of. And Emily's behind the camera, so I'm going to go at her first. What do you think?
That's so foreboding. That music was so foreboding.
That's the Skyrim theme done by Peter Hollins and Lindsay Stern. Thank you.
Oh, cool.
I love them.
So next, I was going to say, like, what it's like to be possessed by a demon.
There you go. Okay. Brad, what do you think?
Rain accepting Dagmar's submission.
Okay. Definitely mythological story on that one. Although, you could tell a naturalistic version of that would be really interesting. Like the shaky cam documentary footage version of Dagmar and Rain meeting. That could be really cool.
There's a story I've been wanting to work into, a short story, and I think it would work really well for this, of Quinn tracking down the ambassador from the Undying, where he tracked the slavers. I needed criminal and nature to do it, and Valkorix was like, "Oh yeah, Quinn tracked slavers a lot of time." And I'm like, yeah, I was tracking them, and so it'll be fun.
All right, cool.
To see to work that in.
Stephanie?
Maybe that time in the ways. That'd be a good story. the clearing out the ways.
Yeah.
That was a creepy story too.
At the last event with the
Yeah.
thing coming down the
Yeah.
hill, yeah.
Yeah.
Josh,
So Besson kind of had his whole big scouting trip he did for like a year or so.
that would be great.
So doing not only that, but using that as a way to do the fall of Kurnow from the Fomorians, and then here was what the aftermath was as well. Kind of trying to maybe work those into.
That would be like a grand scale kind of story. That'd be
Yeah.
neat. Okay.
Adventures on Enos Whiterun with the Captured Reaper.
There you go. All right. Also known as Costain Kicks Down the Door.
I totally see Kevin and Hobbs in there.
There was some serious Calvin Ball action going on, that's for sure. What you got, Ashley?
Probably like the backstory stuff where my character makes her heroic choice and now it's leading into the end of the choice.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to mention it specifically, but since you brought it up, I'm going to use it as a segue.
Can I make her say it again? Because I don't think the audio
Sure,
picked it
go
up.
for it.
Hi, Ashley. Tell us that again.
My backstory where I made my heroic choice and it's just now all coming to an end.
Thank you.
So to close out the class, I'm going to say that there is one story that everybody has that they can tell if they so choose, and that's the story of your heroic choice. As heroes, that's a thing that connects all of you and is a thing that instantly will get you gravitas or grounding with your audience. Not like you're grounded, but like grounding. I'm paying attention to the story because it's important. Because everybody's heroic choice is tied together because it's what unifies all of the heroes. So it doesn't matter who you're sitting around the fire with. If you start telling the story of your heroic choice, everybody's going to pay attention.
Because that's so important to our characters. Yours is going to be important to us too.
And-
because that importance is transferred.
Well, I think it almost becomes like a bunch of mothers sitting around and one person mentions, my pregnancy was like.
Yes!
Yeah.
And then they all start sharing their story.
Exactly.
Or the first year teaching. All teachers
Right.
have that dread.
Exactly. So on that really awesome note, and I'm totally going to end the next class with that too. I'm going to send you guys on to your next class. Thank you for listening to me vomit at you for a while. That wasn't quite as interactive as I intended, but I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for coming, and bye.